Howdy, and welcome to Wise About Texas, the Texas History Podcast. This is your host, Ken Wise. Thank you very much for tuning in today for a little bit of Texas history. I wanted to update you a little bit on what's been going on at Wise About Texas. The biggest news is that I completed a master's degree in history last May. This podcast being released in July 2025. And I probably should have updated you sooner, but I want to say thanks to the folks at Sam Houston State University. It took me a while, only had time to do one class a semester, so it took me a few years, but I got it. And this podcast led directly to that, I think, as I got more involved in the academic side of history. I already have a doctorate degree. A law degree is called a jurist doctorate, but I had skipped the master's level. And so I thought, well, I'll go get a master's in history so I can have that academic training. So that's very exciting. Not sure what it's going to get me, but certainly some evidence that I care a lot about the practice of Texas history. Today, I want to talk a little bit about a Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. Now, the first Chief Justice of the Texas Supreme Court was James Collinsworth, but the court really never met under Chief Justice Collinsworth's leadership. Thomas Rusk served as Chief Justice of the Texas Supreme Court, and they met a couple of times, but nothing regular or of any duration. However, the next Chief Justice made a critical impact on Texas and Texas law. So today we're going to go back to 1840 and get wise about Texas. John Hemphill was born in December 1803 in Chester County, South Carolina, which is just across the border from Charlotte, North Carolina. He was the fifth child, but he was named after his father, who was a pastor at the Hopewell Presbyterian Church there. Hemphill was educated in Latin, in Greek, in mathematics, and English literature. He attended college at a Presbyterian school in Pennsylvania and graduated in 1825. He started out as a school teacher, of all things, but soon decided that he needed to become a lawyer. So the way you became a lawyer back in those days in the early 19th century was you did something that we call reading law. And this actually continued into the 20th century. And reading law means you basically did an apprenticeship under a licensed attorney, and you literally read the law and learned it, and then were submitted to an examination, usually an oral examination by lawyers of your community, and then licensed to practice. So there was no bar exam back then. So he read the law. He was licensed in 1829, and he began a law practice in South Carolina. And he also, now this part of South Carolina was always a hotbed of what I will describe as anti-federal activity. And if you study the Civil War, you find a lot of secessionists coming out of this area of South Carolina. And back in 1829, the issue was nullification, which I'll explain in a minute. And Hemphill joined the side of the nullifiers. In 1832, South Carolina passed what it called the Ordinance of Nullification. And that all started with a tariff that the federal government imposed that favored the North and was much harder on the South. And what nullification was, in this ordinance specifically, it purported to nullify federal law as applied to South Carolina. So the idea was that the states had the power to nullify the federal law. Now, I won't go too deep into this, but if you go back and read the U.S. Constitution, and I encourage you to do so at every opportunity, it will strike you that this is an agreement, a contract of sorts between the states. And so many thought, well, the power was intended to reside in the states, which is true if you read the document, and therefore the states had the power to nullify laws made by the federal government, at least as they applied to those states. That's a little stickier conversation. And it sounds weird to our ears in 2025 because everything is so federalized. But back then, it was not unusual. And Andrew Jackson managed to negotiate his way out of that potential situation But of course, if you fast forward 30 years, South Carolina was the first state to secede, and the Civil War started off its coast. Well, Hemphill went on to serve in the Seminole War in Florida in 1836. Unfortunately, ended up contracting malaria, as was common in Florida at that time. So he moved to Texas, moved to Washington on the Brazos. Now, Texas, as you read Texas history, you see that Texas, a lot of people moved to Texas thinking that it would be healthier and would cure whatever disease they had, a more salubrious climate, should we say. When he got to Texas, he started learning Spanish and started studying Spanish law because it, of course, affected Texas very directly. He quickly became a well-known and prominent citizen, and he was elected as a district court judge in January 1840. Now, the Texas legislature did the judicial elections back then. Nowadays, judges run in partisan elections, but back then the legislature elected him. So he was elected to be the district judge of the 4th Judicial District. The Texas Constitution allowed the legislature to create up to 8 judicial districts, but they decided to create 4. And the 4th was originally Gonzales County, Jackson County, Victoria County, Goliad County, Refugio County, San Patricio County, and Bexar County. So this was the court that John Hemphill took over in January of 1840. Later that year, in December of 1840, he was elected as the Chief Justice of the Texas Supreme Court. And back in the Republic days, the Supreme Court consisted of the judges of the district court. So he was already an associate justice, but was elected the Chief Justice the December following his taking the district court bench. One thing we should talk about while he was a district judge, Bexar County, of course, San Antonio de Bexar was one of the towns in which he held court. Something very significant happened in that town shortly after he took the bench, and that's the council house fight. Now, the council house fight's going to get its own episode one day, but let me just give you a little preview since Hemphill was involved. Some Comanche chiefs had come to Austin in January of 1840, and they said that they wanted to make a peace treaty. The Comanches had promised to bring all the white captives that they had taken into San Antonio, but the experience of the early Texans with the Comanches made them realize that that may not come to pass. So they put 3 companies of infantry in San Antonio. The Adjutant General Hugh McLeod and the Quartermaster General William Cook were going to speak for the Texians. The Comanches came in to negotiate on March 19th, 1840. And there were 65 men, women, and children that came to San Antonio, but they only brought 1 captive. So the Texans' suspicions had proven true. That captive was Matilda Lockhart, and she told the people there in San Antonio that there were other captives, but they had held them back, hoping to bring them in one by one and get a higher price. So they assemble in the council house in San Antonio, which was on the east side of the main plaza, and the Comanche chief, the spokesman, was named Mukwara. He said the other captives were with other tribes, and then there was a very pregnant pause, at which point Mukwara spoke again, which is a mistake in such a negotiation, and he said, well, how do you like that answer? So the Texians marched 1 company of infantry into the room and the other to the rear of the building, which Adjutant General McLeod later described as where the warriors were. There was a little more talking while the soldiers got into place, but once the soldiers were in place, the Comanche chiefs were informed that they were now captives until the white captives were brought in. At that point, a general fight ensued. Guns were drawn and fired, and knives were pulled out. Well, one of the citizens in the council house room, being a prominent citizen, was Judge John Hemphill. Judge Hemphill confronted one of the Comanche chiefs, drew his Bowie knife, and dispatched him right there in the council house. The rest of that story is the fight spilled out into the street, and the Indians were defeated, and one Indian woman was sent back to the tribe to tell them about the defeat. That led to a big raid, which led to another battle, but that's a story for another day. The point is, Judge Hemphill, in addition to sitting on the bench, was forced to fight the Comanches hand-to-hand, and did so successfully. Later, he was called back into service after he was elected Chief Justice of the Texas Supreme Court, and this was in 1841. He served as the acting adjutant general during the Somerville expedition. Now, the Somerville expedition was mounted to counter 3 different Mexican invasions of Texas during 1842. One at Fort La Pontalan, and then 2 captures, successful captures of San Antonio by 2 different Mexican generals. In retaliation, Sam Houston called for an expedition to be led by Alexander Somerville. And his instructions were to go to the border and to invade Mexico if Somerville thought that it could be done. Well, it wasn't hard to find volunteers for this expedition, and there were about 700 of them when they left San Antonio in November 1842, and Chief Justice Hemphill was there. They eventually took over Laredo. They took over Guerrero. At that point, Somerville called it off, realized he wasn't going to get much further. I'm not exactly sure if he ever really thought that 700 men were going to invade Mexico and conquer it. But in any event, he ordered everybody home. Hemphill returns. A bunch of the men did not return. They continued, and that became the Mayer expedition, which resulted in the Black Bean incident. Again, a story for another day. But what it shows is that the judges of the Republic of Texas weren't just jurists. They also had to fight. And Hemphill was right there at the front. While he was on the Texas Supreme Court, he wrote 37 legal opinions. He was either an associate justice or the Chief Justice during every session that the Supreme Court held during the Republic of Texas era. The Supreme Court really didn't meet in any significant way until he was a part of it in 1840, is why I say that. When Texas entered the United States in 1846, Hemphill was appointed Chief Justice of the new Texas Supreme Court, and he served in that role until 1858, when he was elected to succeed Sam Houston as a U.S. Senator. And Hemphill's service on the Supreme Court was significant because of that Spanish he had learned. He had learned the language when he came to Texas, and he had the foresight to understand that Spanish and later Mexican law would play an important role in cases involving matters that and circumstances that existed before Texas was an independent republic. There's basically 2 types of law that he could have learned. One was it's called the civil law, the Spanish civil law, and then there was the English common law, which listeners are probably more familiar with. That's the system, the English common law system, that the United States adopted and eventually Texas adopted. But that didn't solve every problem in Texas because so many matters were governed up until Texas independence and even beyond by Spanish civil law. When Texas won independence, for example, there was no law. I mean, you win the revolution, you have a new country. Texas hadn't adopted any kind of law. So those first judges of the Republic were sort of free to use anything they thought appropriate. Interestingly, Louisiana still uses the civil law system. That's the only state in the Union, I believe, that uses that system. Of course, it came from France, but it was very similar to the Spanish civil law. Now, a couple of different aspects of the Spanish civil law have made it into Texas law. And you can thank John Hemphill for that. One of the reasons he had such a good reputation was he was able to harmonize that Spanish civil law that he had studied with the English common law, which Texas eventually adopted. A couple of examples include community property. That's a Spanish civil law concept, which is part of Texas law today. And if you look around, the biggest community property states were all part of Spain: Florida, Texas, and California. Another facet of Spanish law that made it into Texas law is the homestead exemption. protecting your homestead against creditors. Hemphill addressed both those issues. Fast forwarding to 1858, Sam Houston was a U.S. Senator, had refused to support the secession of Texas from the Union, so the Texas legislature replaced him with John Hemphill. John Hemphill, of course, recollecting his upbringing in South Carolina, favored secession, and he would attend the secession convention. He would go on to serve in the Provisional Confederate Congress. Unfortunately, contracted pneumonia while in Richmond, Virginia, the capital, and he died in 1862. He was eulogized with the greatest respect, however, in his new home state of Texas. Younger lawyers had always referred to Hemphill as Padre, which was a nod to his role as mentor, as well, of course, as to his command of the Spanish language and law, and his body was brought back to Texas and buried in the state cemetery. In 1883, there was a ceremony to hang the portrait of John Hemphill in the Supreme Court. That's a great judicial tradition that exists not just in the Supreme Court, but also the appellate courts and the district courts, the hanging of a portrait of a former judge. In response to the speech presenting the portrait to the court, then Chief Justice A.H. Willey said this about John Hemphill, quote, "Texas owes a debt of gratitude to the noble men who led her armies to victory when victory meant freedom, and defeat enslavement and perhaps butchery. But she owes much also to the men who in civil life or on the judicial bench in her earlier days sustained the cause of justice and of right, and helped to perpetuate the liberties her volunteers had so nobly won. They too should be held in grateful remembrance. Their deeds, though less shining, should be cherished for the solid benefits derived from them." Close quote. I think Justice Willey was exactly correct in his comparison of Hemphill to the heroes of the Alamo, the martyrs at Goliad, the victors at San Jacinto was certainly appropriate. And John Hemphill deserves his place in Texas history as one of the great Chief Justices of the Texas Supreme Court. Well, now we come to a part of the episode I call Getting There, where I'll tell you where to see a couple of things that were mentioned in the episode. I'm going to say go to the Capitol building in Austin, and if you go to the third floor, you can visit the old original Supreme Court courtroom. Now, the Capitol, of course, was built, the current Capitol, in 1886, so it's not the exact same room where John Hemphill presided, but that 1883 John Hemphill portrait that was presented to the Supreme Court hangs in the center above the bench in that 1886 Supreme Court courtroom. It's a beautiful room. You cannot walk in it, but you can walk a couple of steps inside the doorway and see where the Supreme Court presided for so many years in the Capitol. Hemphill is buried in the State Cemetery, also in Austin. It's on Navasota Street off of 7th. And I'm going to give you a description of how to find his grave. His grave marker is about a 15-foot tall white marble monument. So as you walk into the State Cemetery, if you take a right and stay on the sidewalk and follow that little sidewalk, don't get on the main road, follow the sidewalk. It will take you up a hill and deep into the cemetery, walking toward the southwest. And if you go down to where you see Stephen F. Austin's grave, now you can't miss Stephen F. Austin's grave. It's a huge monument with a big statue of Stephen F. Austin on top of it. Behind Stephen F. Austin's grave, between the Austin grave and Navasota Street, is Hemphill's marble monument. And if you walk that direction, you will find it. And I also encourage you to spend a lot of time in the State Cemetery while you're there, because you can learn a lot of Texas history just walking around. Well, that wraps it up for this episode of Wise About Texas. Thank you very much for tuning in today. If you want to support the preservation and promotion of Texas history, go to patreon.com/wiseabouttexas. Find us on Instagram and Twitter at Wise About Texas. And I want to thank you again for listening. Go out and do something for Texas today. And until next time, God bless Texas, and we'll see you down the road.